Jerry. Um, I just got notified that the meeting is in progress, so I got it. All right. That's good to know. And my background, I've taken a bit of a circuitous route. So originally, my training's as a learning scientist. So my master's and doctorate are from Northwestern in the neurobiology of learning and memory. I spent the first decade, roughly, of my professional career as a professor of education and psychology at Riviera University in Nashua. Got bored with tenure after I put out a book on how to use neuroscience to advance education, sort of a user guide to your brain, and then spent the next 9 years after that at Southern New Hampshire, where I headed the research arm of the Innovation Hub. So we were involved in everything from market testing all the way to user testing and then determining transfer learning. And now before we launch into, Stephen mentioned, I have many hats, as it were. So I, with some former colleagues, founded the research consultancy. Through that, we've provided user and usability testing for a few Fortune 500 companies, as well as some startups. I also was just named to the faculty in a teaching capacity at the Berklee College of Music, which, if you've never been, is like Hogwarts for musicians. It's a magical place. I'm an ambassador for Growth Space, which is an HR startup that based on skills development, and I'm the chief learning architect for Edge Learning. So with all of that, oh, and a hand's already raised. Oh no, it's clapping. So let's jump in. So my background is varied, but the common thread through all of it is around research. That has been really the one constant in my life. And as Stephen said, I sort of let him know and Emily as well that kind of how I like to approach a topic like this is really somewhat anecdotal. And the reason for that comes from my own experience. When I first started graduate school, I got to be the TA for the professor in whose laboratory I worked. And the man had been tenured longer than I'd been on the planet at that point in time. And he was bored with teaching the same thing over and over again. So he had this brilliant idea, and maybe it was to test me, that he would teach neuroscience backwards. That's not possible. However, at a very young age and very early in my academic career, I learned what not to do. And I learned how advantageous it can be to see all the pitfalls as they arise. So the first part of this talk is really following that same example of what happens when user testing wasn't properly implemented. And so we're going to start out with an example from Amazon. And we're going to rewind the clock 10 years. 10 years ago, there was no pandemic. 10 years ago, we didn't think that wearing jammy pants to work was acceptable. And 10 years ago, on June 14th, Jeff Bezos claimed that the Fire Phone was going to reset the entire smartphone market. So, what went wrong? Why aren't we all running off of Fire phones right now? Well, I'll start off by telling you that Amazon went against how it has normally operated. It, rather than focus exclusively on starting with the customer, which is how it had become so incredibly large, and had run any number of mom and pop businesses out of contention. But instead, Jeff Bezos, and this really did come from the top. There have been, articles in Fast Company and other places, sort of the deep dive post-mortem. He did not want to get left behind and thought it was odd that people would be using other devices to interface with Amazon. So the issue with this is he forced forward the phone before it was ready into a market that had very little room. And most importantly, he inserted himself into the process of design and would mandate that certain features be included. So this is a prime example of what happens when user testing is not embraced, but it's one that's outside any designer's control. Because when you got a guy who, just for the fun of it, can go into outer space, it's kind of hard to tell him no. However, Parma does have a long memory. And so, for those of you playing at home, you might remember it didn't end well for the Fire phone. May, you know, whatever religion you are, may it rest in peace. And for those of you who, again, Amazon does so many things right. As a non-designer, and you can tell I'm a non-designer because I'm on a PC instead of a Mac, but as a non-designer, for me, the Amazon logo is so amazing, right? Because not only does it go, of course, from A to Z, but it's a smile. However, not doing user testing, not embracing the ability to actually learn from mistakes or be wrong, took what is also a smile and turned it into a frown. So nowadays, we've got even more examples of what happens when we don't engage in user testing, in part because we fast forward from June 6th in 2014 to instead late November in 2022, we then had the advent of generative AI. Generative AI coming forward, and now I'm sure anyone on this phone who interfaces with someone in business, all we get asked is, well, how can we use AI for this? Or it gets implemented. However, in the mad rush, yet again, there have been, even as recently as the last 2 weeks, examples of what happens when you don't properly implement user testing instead of to confirm your hypothesis, but to test what could happen when things go awry. And so, if you'd been following, you know that this particular example is from Gemini. So, Gemini is a Google product. It was their souped up next iteration of Bard. And they had implemented, and again, I can't stress enough, it was actually coming from a really good place. So, as we know, the way generative AI works is it scours the internet, looks for statistical frequency. And so, the more frequently something occurs, it then takes that information and uses it when it generates images. So they wanted to counteract that or contradict it so that if the majority of web pages, for example, only show individuals of who self-identify or who look as white, it wanted to make sure that it wouldn't only produce images of humans because there are more images of people that look that way. However, by not testing it, they ran into a debacle where what we can see here is when Gemini was asked to, unfortunately, generate images from a 1943 German soldier, we can see an individual who looks as though they're aboriginal to the United States, so a Native American or American Indian, someone of Asian descent, someone who is looks Caucasian, it could be from Western Europe, and then someone who is decidedly not. And it's not just Gemini, because Meta, unfortunately, has the same issue. And again, I don't want to get into the politics of this. This is about really having an idea to do good, or if we go way back in the Google terms, to not do evil, but to not test it. And to not test it in all the different ways that you think it might. So, for example, to use circumstances where it should not generate something that you normally would want it to. And this is not just something that happens with large companies. Just to finish off with something that maybe is a little less politically charged. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Pack and Save, but Pack and Save is a grocery chain out of New Zealand. And they had a great idea when generative AI came out, which was they would integrate their app when you're shopping with generative AI. So if you, for example, had tomatoes and bacon and lettuce in your cart, you could ask it, what can I make with this? And it would produce a menu item. It would give you an example. It's pretty nice. It even would include quippy little joke at the start. You can see the dad joke to lead off with the pun on meat, and then it would tell, and it would even give it a name that would be memorable, right? These aren't just BLTs, they're outstanding BLTs. But again, yeah, 8 slices of bread. So, but again, it's 8 slices of bread, but only 4 slices of bacon. So we can see that as being problematic. But not nearly as problematic as what happened when people put in some other combinations of ingredients. So, for example, ammonia and bleach, two things you can also find in a grocery store. And this is the exact, I'm not making this up, this is exactly what the meal bot produced. Aromatic water mix. I feel compelled for legal reasons right now to say, and just remind everyone, never combine ammonia and bleach. What you create is chloramine gas, which is incredibly poisonous. It might be aromatic. I don't know that anyone has survived long enough to be able to report on what it smells like. And the last, I do love the last here. Serve chilled and enjoy the refreshing fragrance, excuse me. And I do have one more example. It's because of course this had to happen. Somebody gave these 4 ingredients, and this is actually what the AI bot came back with. Yes. So, although I am not a big proponent of Skynet or in thinking that AI will take over and become our overlords, this is a case where maybe it actually could. It's just going to do it very, very stealthily. So those are examples of not fully testing, right? Going out quickly because you want to beat your competitor to the market, because you want to embrace a new technology. But at their core, what, yeah, it did escalate quite quickly. But at their core, what these all have in mind, or all have in common, excuse me, is the same issue, which is testing was not conducted to help not just the designers and developers, but everyone involved to find the blind spots, to actually see where is it that, this isn't quite ready for prime time yet. And the problem is when you frame your testing in terms of does it work and does it do what I want it to do, then what you're doing by begging the question is introducing biases. And we have to keep in mind, and this is something that, we keep getting reinforced over and over again anytime we do research, but it's, I think, critical to reinforce it here, this notion that our brains are not always our best friends. And that is where these biases come into play. So here's a prime example. We have on this call individuals who are professional designers. And what we're looking at right now is a very simple checkerboard where we have square labeled A and square labeled B. And I think if I were to ask, is there anything unusual about square A or square B, or actually we'll just pose it. You can see the chat. What's unusual about squares A and B? Or you can come off mute. I'm fine with either. didn't know this would be interactive.
Yeah, Roger saying they're the same color. Cal saying B should be larger than A despite them looking the same size. I love these visual puzzles.
All right. Well, Roger, well done. I don't know if you've seen this before, but if we instead let's remove those and take them off of the checkerboard, we can see that they're actually the exact same color. Nothing changed from here to here other than the fact that the surroundings were changed. The context clues that our brain uses in what's called top-down processing, right? And sometimes we use those visual cues. We use things like that in terms of how our brains operate. I mean, the NHUXPA logo has movement, right? It's not static. It has an angle so that there's a three-dimensional capacity or perspective to it. And that's exactly it. So we've got these cues that we use. So we can't even always trust our eyes. So that's one thing we have to do. Another is we have to think about a situation. So this is a classic example that many of you have probably seen, but during World War II, the US military was trying to understand how to protect pilots and members of bombers better, right? So the crew of a B-52 or other bomber. And so what they tried to do first was examine on all the returning planes, where were the planes taking the most fire? Where was the most damage to those planes? And that's what's represented by these red dots. And they were somewhat struck by how they should shield it in that particular area. So what they did is they reached out to a Yale statistician by the name of Abraham Wald. He was a Hungarian emigre. And they asked him to look at the data. And one of the interesting things he said when he was first confronted with it is, thank God you came to me because of my training in thinking about maths. First of all, I love the fact that Europeans refer to it as maths, because it should. It's mathematics. But second of all, he was right, because what wasn't considered was the fact that these were the planes that came back, which meant they were perfectly capable of flying with damage in those areas. The areas where they did not have damage was actually where you needed to put the armor. And again, you can't obviously put armor on the entire thing because you have to at some point get it into the air. And this actual finding is credited in part with one of the ways in which the Allies were able to actually win World War II, because they were able to reduce the number of bombers that had to be produced. They were able to reduce their casualties, so on and so forth. And this is often referred to as survivor bias. But it comes back to the same idea of what are our biases and what are the data we're looking at? What are they actually telling us? And it also means that sometimes we've got to zoom out, if you will, and think about what we're not seeing. So now, and I hope folks, at least in the chat, are willing to play along a little bit. So I have a sequence, and that sequence has 3 digits, 2, 4, 6. I know the rule that I use to make that sequence. What you're able to do, so how we're going to engage in this activity is you'll place, please, I ask you, if you'll play along, to put in the chat other sequences of numbers that you think would match the rule I'm thinking of. And what I will do is tell you if they are correct or incorrect. You as a group, as an audience, will get 2 guesses total, collectively, to then tell me what the rule is. All right, so you're essentially putting forward those sequences, right? test whatever you think that rule is, gather those data, and then you'll put forward what you think the rule is. So someone can put in there three numbers that they think will match the rule that I use. All right, great. 8, 10, 12. That is correct. That matches the rule. 8, 16, 32. That is correct. That matches the rule. 10, 16, 26. That is correct. 1, 3, 5. That is correct. Does anybody want to use one of the two collective? Oh, 9, 6, 3. That is incorrect.
So with that, I guess I'll put out the first guess based on what we've seen so far. The numbers have to be in ascending order. Each
That
number
is
has to be bigger than the one before it.
that is exactly right. That is it. So that is great.
Good teamwork, everybody.
Usually groups use both guesses. So hats off to you for that. Well, let's look at the data that were collected. It goes up by twos. It repeats exactly what we were looking at. Then it stays with the evens and looks at doubles. Still stays with the evens, but now looks at what if we add it together, sort of a quasi Fibonacci. Now we go up by twos, but still going up. And then finally, on the one, two, third, fourth, fifth, sixth guess, we now try to negate. Now we work to actually falsify the idea that this is what the rule is. So it shows, in a way, that our normal tendency is actually not to falsify. It is actually to try and put things forward to try to confirm our hypothesis. That's exactly how we're wired. And as an example, when I now have, so Stephen has a brand new human. I have three used humans. That sounds odd. I have three teenage daughters. And when my now 20-year-old was 6.5, my now 14-year-old was approximately 7 months old enough to sit up. And so I was there with them, and this probably more like 10-month-old. So she's sitting up and just sort of, doing what 10-month-olds do. There's a lot of drooling. There's kind of moving things around. It's a lot of fun. And my oldest girl, I don't know where my middle daughter was at the time, but that's on par. Um, because as you'll find, Stephen, once you get a second, you have a spare, and it's like all bets are off. Um, so uh, so anyway, my oldest turns to me and she said, "Dad, guess what I found out?" I said, "What, Sophia?" And she said, "Julia knows her name." I said, "Get out of here." And she said, "Watch, Julia." And of course, my little youngest daughter kind of turns and looks towards the voice and smiles. And Sophia's very happy. Now, what ends up happening when you have a child of a psychological researcher and my wife is a clinical psychologist is you don't just say, "That's great," and move on. Instead, you say, "Well, let's actually test this." And so I then, um, to my daughter's chagrin, said, "All right, here we go. Tiberius." And sure enough, my youngest daughter, Julia, turns and looks at me and smiles. So again, this is not to show how horribly I treated my oldest daughter or a parenting fail, but instead to really speak to the fact that we're wired to try to confirm something and move forward. It actually is somewhat counterintuitive for us to design a study, because it's really what she did, right? She designed the study through the demonstration. Um, but it's not something that comes naturally to us. And we can see that even in another somewhat, um, excuse me, we can see that in other studies, this notion that our mental set, that's what we call it. So the fact that we were going up, for example, in the exercise we were doing, going up by twos, I put that into place. Here's the mental set. And so the first three or four sequences went up by twos. It was almost as though I set the parameters, but I really didn't, right? That wasn't the rule. It wasn't that you had to follow, but yet we still did so. So that's something we've got to break out of when we are user testing. We've got to be aware of what our mental set is. We've got to be aware of what our biases are, and we've got to work against human nature. And that's what that example from my two daughters is really sort of putting forward. So we're going to look at one more example here of what what happens when we're confronted with ideas. So here, let's say we've got four double-sided cards. All right, the cards have either a letter on one side and they have a letter on one side and a number on the other. And what I'm going to say to you is the card is a vowel, right, on one side, then it has an even number on the other. So, two questions. What is the minimum number of cards that you have to turn over to find out if that rule has been followed to? That's what we mean by validate. And then the second question is which cards? So go ahead and put your guesses in the chat if you are so willing. So we're just going off the four cards we're looking at. EK 4 and 7. So to make sure or to see if the rule had been adhered to, how many of those cards? All right, so I see two, I see two, I see two, so that's good. All right, and then guesses as to which cards. All right, fantastic. So two cards, definitely it. Here's the thing, half of people will say you turn over the E and the 4. E is 100% correct. You definitely would turn that one over, but no different than saying Julia instead of Tiberius or sticking with the mental set. Half of folks will look at the 4. Here's the thing. I've lost control. There we go. Less than 5% will turn over the E and the 7. So what this again is showing us is that this is not human nature. So it really is something that we've got to work at. We have to be conscious of in our testing when we set up these types, when we set up anything, we've got to really think about, you know, I've heard it described as darling side, right? We've got to kill our darlings. We've got to set up our designs with the thought that it doesn't matter how much time we've put into it or how cool we think it is. We've got to ask ourselves, what are the data that would convince us that it's not? And then we design our study to facilitate that. And this goes back to really the scientific endeavor at its core. I know that there's a lot of talk oftentimes about and I think it's erroneous, about the fact that user testing or guerrilla testing um, is not about science. And what I'm talking about here has nothing to do with statistical significance or patterns or trends. It's about making sure that the data we get are usable. And that is going to rely on what we would call Popperian epistemology, in terms of thinking about the history of the philosophy of science from Karl Popper, which is that it's only through a refutation that we can really gain this confidence in what we're looking to test. So taking that, what are we going to do with that, right? Because I've given a couple of examples, um, sort of joking, I've given from my life. We've looked at in this sort of middle portion, we've really kind of dug into the notion of um, really what does the scientific literature show us? How does that sort of bear out this inability on our part to move forward with falsifying? So, a couple things are actually what we can do is first of all, just follow best practices, right? So, we want to avoid leading items and prompts. You don't want to ask somebody, how much did you enjoy this? Right? Because just by doing that, you're actually directing someone in a particular direction. Psychologists who've studied things like the falsification of memory have shown time and time again over the last half century that, for example, with eyewitness testimony, if a police officer were to ask you as a witness to a car crash, how fast was car A going when it blank into car B? If the police officer were to say when it contacted, your estimate of its speed will be approximately 30% lower than if it said how fast was it going when it crashed. Nothing changed in terms of what that person saw. What has changed is the language that's used. So it does matter, this notion of priming. Of course, having a diverse representation of users is going to always be beneficial whenever is possible. That's nothing new. But we also need to design to avoid biases. And a lot of what we've talked about here would fall into this notion of the confirmation bias, which is nobody wants to be wrong. And so, in part, we also are drawn towards information, towards interpreting findings that will confirm or, in a way, make it so that we are not incorrect. This is the same reason why individuals of a conservative political bent are more likely to watch Fox News. Individuals of a liberal political bent are more apt to watch MSNBC. There are particular newspapers that are, again, bought preferentially by individuals of a particular political leaning because it takes less energy to have your beliefs confirmed. But how do we do that actually? So we can design, but what are the ways we should do that? So I've got here five what I would say are the best practices for trying to design in such a way that you're falsifying yourself. So the first is the earlier you can test and the more honestly rudimentary but usable your wireframes or prototypes are, the less you'll have invested. And that's going to modify how much you want it to be correct. Because you don't have any sort of a sunk cost where now you're trying to determine whether or not, do you have the time? Do you have the resources? It's something that is really critical. And again, I know as a researcher, it's easy for me to say test often and early, but that really is going to also help, again, in terms of making it so that you don't have a vested interest as a designer in the outcome of the testing. We just talked about this notion of directionality. Make it as open ended as you possibly can. especially if it's going to be unmoderated, where there's no chance for a follow-up. If you're doing think alouds or something like that, you want it to be clear in terms of directions. Again, that's a best practice, but you want it to be as open-ended as possible. And you want to make sure that you're not guiding individuals in any way. Along those lines, you also, if you're going to have somebody go through multi steps, for example, to go through a new part of a user journey, don't tell them to log in, find a shirt, put it in the cart, and then go to checkout. Instead, tell them to purchase a shirt and get to the place where they would be prompted with money. You don't want to walk them through, again, each of the sub goals, because that's going to influence the navigability. You're de facto telling them where to search as opposed to collecting data on how they search and whether or not they find something. Um, anyone who's lamented we thought the hamburger was going to die, and then we went mobile, and now the hamburger will never die. Um, but it doesn't change the fact that it makes it really hard to find things, even on a mobile device. So that's something. Another is don't use wording from your copy or your micro copy in your discussion scripts. Because again, this is a leading question, and it feels like you're trying to make it so that, especially in a non-moderated, that you're going to get the best bang for your buck from your user testers, but ultimately you're skewing the data because part of what it is about is not just having a delightful experience, it's about having an experience that it's in a way you want it to be parsimonious. You want to be able to do whatever you need as quickly as possible and have it be enjoyable along the way. This penultimate one, the hamburger will live. The penultimate one is one that's hard for us oftentimes uh, to think about. And this is coming from someone who pulls together user persona, which is the notion that we have to always remember this is not a real person. This is a fabrication. This is an individual whom we're constructing from information in a generalizable way. And it doesn't matter how unique or how many heartstrings we pull with their backstory, they don't exist. And so we don't want to necessarily design in a way that we're, what data scientists would call overfit the model. And then the last is, as hard as it is, be a devil's advocate for your own designs. That's a tricky thing. But again, first step is just this notion of, what would it take for me, again, either to accept that this isn't the best way to go, or, if you're doing A/B testing, this particular flow or this design isn't the best, or make it that you're someone else. What would it take for someone to convince you? Sometimes that perspective taking is all it takes to put yourself in that mindset. And one thing I just want to take a moment here before we get to questions to mention is that a lot of what we talk about when we talk about biases, availability bias, confirmation bias, representativeness bias, this came out of the groundbreaking work of Dan Kahneman, who actually passed away yesterday at the age of 90. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for his amazing work in decision making. He wrote a great book back in 2015 called Thinking Fast and Slow. If you've not read it, I would definitely check it out from your library. He did a masterful job of distilling decades of just top-notch research into how we delude ourselves and what we tell ourselves and the impact that has on our decisions and our behavior. Um, And this quote from him was relayed in a book written where he was interviewed by Adam Grant that just came out in December. And I love this quote. And again, it felt like a really opportune way to wrap up this brief conversation with all of you. Being wrong is the only way I feel sure I've learned anything. And so rest in peace, Dr. Kahneman. Um, and just so that we don't completely go out on a sad note, I'll put a little quippy comic here. But again, I've heard the rhetoric from both sides, time to do my own research. And I love this. Literally, the first link that agrees with what you already believe, jackpot. Thank you all. And hopefully this was a decent use of 40 minutes of your Thursday night.
Thank you so much. Absolutely wonderful presentation. Really love the broad overview around challenging our own thinking. You know, and as researchers, as people who call themselves user experience experts and user professionals, really a great way to remind ourselves we are human too, just as much as the other people we are testing with. So thank you so much for pulling that all together. I love the way you flowed through everything. Yeah, please, anybody, if you have any thoughts or anything, feel free to drop them in the chat. A few notes I was putting out, I'd love to start with to kick off the Q&A. To rewind back towards some of the first stories you were talking through, you know, looking at does it work and does it do what I want it to do as very common introductory just pathways for our research, for our testing that themselves introduce bias. Are there some better pathways or better questions we should be asking ourselves when we're planning our first research stages that will put us maybe down, obviously not the right path the first time, but check ourselves a little bit as we're starting to plan things out?
Yeah, and so that's a great question. Um, you know, a lot of times, so what the reason why I'm hedging is that sometimes when folks will talk about psychological research and behavior, people are like, it can't be that simple or it can't be that easy. But what I'm about to say is, which is even by framing it in terms of working or not, actually presupposes that it will. So
Mm,
a lot of it is just even the language we use with ourselves. So rather than that, it's more what is the experience? Have it be completely open. And if we are as open as we possibly can, then we're going to also be thinking in those terms. And we might find things that we didn't even know about or we hadn't even considered. If again we're not just thinking in terms of does it work, we might discover some new way of interfacing or some way that our users are interacting with the design or a component that we hadn't even thought of, and we would miss if we were just thinking in terms of does it work.
great distinction. Thank you very much. Yeah, and again, goes to really hand in hand with how we're conducting the study itself, as you pointed out, you know, making sure we're not asking leading questions. You know, love the call out on avoiding using our own interface copy, you know, within our study questions and results. I think that's a great one right there, where it's not something you necessarily think about, where even if you're trying not to guide people, you're pulling off words and experiences that you've been looking at, you know, on your own for quite a while versus somebody coming in completely outside of the perspective of the project being worked on.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Another one to kind of dive in a little more grounded, you know, your first story regarding the Fire Phone, and the, as sometimes known, the hippo problem, the highest paid person's opinion. Have you had any experiences, you know, in your own work conducting research in partnering with these organizations where you're trying to do the same thing? You're trying to override their bias, or you're really trying to persuade them to look at the recommendations from the data over what they're coming in on, and how you help people, especially stakeholders, overcome their own bias where they're not doing the research themselves. They don't have this kind of testing background.
It can be a struggle. Like I would be, remiss if I made it out that, all you need is the science and people will get on board. Um, I wish that were the case, but it's not. What I have found is introducing some of these examples, but not, walking folks through them. But so in one case, we were thinking about, without telling tales out of school, I was converting with the CEO who really wanted to pivot into a particular area, and and the data I was looking at from a market level, from uh, a workplace level, was telling me something completely different. And the conversation we ended up having, and I'll just cut to the chase real quickly. I lost and we pivoted. Um, 2 years later, I was right. But regardless, so it's a long game sometimes. It played out that I was correct. Um, so two things. One was, but what I tried to make the case to this individual was, and again, he was open to discussion. I said, well, you know, whom are you hearing this from? And it turned out he was hearing it from other people in the C-suite. And other people in the C-suite were saying, well, this is where we really feel like we should turn, where we should pivot. And the individuals who were going to have to implement and hire and sell, so the folks who were actually going to the consumers, weren't interested. They were not looking at the brand that this particular company had as being consistent with where they wanted to pivot to. And so I tried my damnedest to say, you're running in different circles. And in the circles you're running in, you're all talking as peers, but that's not what's happening on the ground. And I attributed a bit to, it's kind of a play off that survivor bias. You're just looking at what's all you're looking at is the information you're getting, and not thinking about what you're not.
Yeah,
But
great call
it's
out.
hard. And sometimes you just have to bite your tongue. Um, I will say I never took the opportunity because, I think I'm decently have a sense of self-preservation. I did not say I told you so.
Why a wise one indeed.
Yeah,
A great question from Nathan in the chat, also
yeah.
on interacting with our business partners, with our stakeholders. How do we present that idea of falsifying our own tests? On trying to get the buy-in that we should be finding out if our answer is wrong. A great call out where being wrong is a risk, it is a cost, it's called out in any bit of our business project planning, and trying to help break through that bias of testing to confirm what we're about to release, or testing to prove that we've minimized our unexpected results and say, oh, this is something we weren't expecting, but this is an edge case. This is an outlier.
Right. Yeah, it's tricky. Again, it's not going to be easy. The way that I usually frame it is penny wise and pound foolish. Um, what is the potential cost of not exploring this, of not learning in this way? And if you're going to have a captive audience whom you're going to be paying, your user testers, wouldn't you want to be able to have the most useful information from them, as opposed to a very myopic view, that it might tell you what you want to hear, but are we just checking a box? And
Mm,
again, it could be that falls on deaf ears, and then you just try to minimize the damage, as it were, or get enough folks so that you can minimize if there are outliers. I mean, there's certain things, where we can learn from 5 or 6 people, like Nielsen Norman says. But what do you do? It's kind of hard when it's 1 out of 5. That's 20%. How do we know that that's an edge case? But again, we're probably only doing that with qualitative. Um, but it's hard. I mean, these are great questions, and that's why giving a talk is sometimes a lot easier than implementing.
Awesome. Thank you. Good perspective there. Another one I had kind of for myself personally, I thought it was very interesting to see the call out on user personas, fabrications, not facts. And I feel like that's something, working with partners over and over, it often is latched onto from people outside the field is we need personas. We got to have personas, got to look at the personas. How would you, recommend or have you had any experience in a more effective way to use them versus just propping them up as we have them? Again, avoiding just checking that box. But if we, they can be a valuable tool for discussion, but what's a better way to use them beyond just framing our questions and our conversation around a real person?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, two ways. One is if you have the ability, it's actually, using something like Amazon Mechanical Turk, you can actually collect data from a lot of folks really cheap. And then the reason I bring that up is so one of the methods I've used for that is to generate quantitative. I use a cluster analysis algorithm to essentially let the numbers pull together. So it's a statistical technique. And if you do that, what you then find is if you've structured your survey, so you start with a survey and you ask people questions, but also around some open-endeds. And then you take those and you let the numbers show you where the folks are. And the nice thing is you're going to also then see where overlap is that you might not if you do it a traditional way, where, which is a modified sort of Delphic model, where you get experts, and that's okay. You get people from marketing and people maybe from sales in a room, and you say, okay, who's doing this? Who's buying it? Or whom do we want to buy it? And if you're going to go that route, then what I would ask also is and this is what we often don't think about, what's the connective tissue between these different users?
Hmm.
So not just the points of distinction, but what is the point of continuity? Because if you do that, then and you can design in part to that, you're also opening yourself up to new potential users who don't fit that at all. And you're again not going to overfit the model, as it were, if I kind of harken back to a data analytics term.
Awesome. Love it. Great perspectives. And I'm pasting here. I've been trying to find it one-handed here, but I believe this is the book you referenced at the end.
Yes.
Certainly looks like a great read. I recognize the cover. I've seen it pop up before, but I think a visit to the local library is certainly in order.
Yeah.
All right, wonderful. Any other final thoughts or closing questions from anybody here in the audience? Yes, a very hearty thank you. This is a really fascinating talk. Love the philosophical perspective as well. And I'm thinking about how we think. It is so, so important because, as you've mentioned here multiple times, we don't know what we don't know. And we are
Yeah.
all struck with the same biases as the people we're testing with. So, love seeing it called out, love seeing the check to really take that step back, especially for people, working in the user experience profession who are often in a very unique position to have those kinds of open and frank conversations with our business partners, with our technical partners, and really try to be that direct line out to the real end users of the product. It's oh so important. So wonderful.
Definitely.
Thank you again for a great talk.
Yes.
Have a wonderful rest of your night, everybody, and we'll see you all in April.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks.